This lecture is focusing on Freytag's pyramid, specifically in emphasizing how important organizing the plot is for narrative writing, especially because when we think about plots in narratives, plots do tend to fall into specific structures, and those structures really are set in place so that the audience knows the background that they need, and of course, so that they can anticipate how that story is going to progress. Especially because if we think about stories, plot organization really helps to build the overall conflict of a story, which makes it interesting. And most importantly, it makes it more effective for the reader and their experience with that story. So, breaking down the different narrative plot requirements, we of course have exposition. Exposition is very similar to the expository writing mode that we talked about previously because of the root of it being exposed. So if you think about exposition for a story, all of the stories need specific information for the audience to understand, care, and become invested in the story. Especially if we think about understanding who the characters are, understanding the time period in which a story takes place, can vastly change how an audience interacts with the events of the story as they're reading it, as well as setting and background information so that an audience can really visualize where a story is taking place or know specific, if we think about background information, relevant details that might have happened before the time period of the story itself. Then we have the inciting incident. So if you think of the word inciting, it is the moment in a story that really begins the conflict of that overall story. If we think about what the inciting incident could be, it could be the moment where a problem first begins. It could be the moment where you have to make a decision that affects how the story moves forward. The rising action then would build off of that inciting incident. The rising action typically are all of the little events, the little scenes that occur between the inciting incident and the climax of the story. The big thing to note about the rising action is that emphasis on rising, describing the action. So if you think about it with conflicts of the story, this is where that conflict is building, the anticipation is building. So that really has to be done in a very nuanced way to keep the audience interested so that they really care and are invested in the climax that is going to be next. The climax is the turning point in the story. That is the moment where all of the tension, all of the conflict is coming to a head, and of course, it's going to be resolved. So, if we think about any stories that have an internal conflict, say we have a main protagonist who's dealing with a really difficult choice, the climax of that story would really be that protagonist making that final decision, being really settled with it, and not having any doubts anymore. On the other hand, with stories that have external conflict, whether it's man versus nature, or man versus society, typically that climax of the story is going to be a lot more detailed, specifically because it's not necessarily centered on that protagonist. It could be centered on a physical or verbal fight with that external enemy, if you will, or it could be that moment where that protagonist, say they are in a man versus nature type of conflict. It's that moment in The Revenant where Leonardo DiCaprio's character is battling it out, and it's that ending moment. Will he survive these elements, or is he finally going to perish before we have that kind of happier ending? Then we have our falling action after the climax of the story. This really is important because it allows the conflict, all of the smaller conflicts, all of that tension that's been building up to disperse. It starts to answer the little questions that maybe were unresolved earlier in the story. The falling action is really building to the overall resolution, or what we call the denouement. The resolution is when we have the ending, so all of the little holes in that plot are being wrapped up, all the questions are answered, or even if we think about the resolution, the narrator is talking about the relevance of the experience or really reflecting on it to bring it to that satisfactory end. The resolution is really important for stories because without a resolution, then we might have too many questions as readers. Oftentimes, if we think about movies or TV shows or books ending in cliffhangers, they're really frustrating. And they're frustrating because the stories lack a resolution. We have too many unanswered questions, and we need to have the answers before we can leave that story satisfied. So when we put all of these different requirements of a narrative together, that's what gives us Freytag's pyramid. So if we notice, Freytag's pyramid literally creates a pyramid. We have the exposition and the denouement being really flat, because that's the foundation, that's what centers us as readers. We have the inciting incident, which is where the exposition line and the rising action line intersect. So it's that specific moment. And then, of course, the rising action, the falling action, they both build to the climax of the story, which brings those together. So following this pyramid can really help us to visualize the plot arc overall, especially so we can plan the conflict of our story, the different scenes, the different details we're including. And of course, it's a great way to make sure that we have all of the elements that we need to make our story effective for our audience. So if we want to visualize this, we can look at the example of Liz Huerta's The Game and how her plot is mapped out using Freytag's pyramid. So if we look at the exposition of her story, all of the exposition is her playing Border Patrol as a child, how the game is played, all of her neighbors, the neighbor children specifically that she played with on Barrett Avenue and Chula Vista, and of course the differences between Huerta and her friends in the neighborhood. So all of those details are really setting up Huerta's perspective as a child and what she felt and what she knew while she was playing this game that she, of course, ended up knowing and acknowledging was wrong. Our inciting incident is when she states, "It wasn't until I was older and stopped playing Border Patrol that I began to think about the game. We never thought about the political significance of what we were playing at." So if we think of that quote, we can tell based on the language that it wasn't until her use of the first person repeatedly that she's becoming very reflective. So this is an indicator that we do have this internal conflict of her trying to deal with this game that she plays as a child, however innocent that act of playing was, her having to deal with the ramifications of what that really meant, especially politically. So we know that she is really dealing with games. So when we think of the rising action, if we think about the significance of it, the rising action really is centered on that experience she has seeing the children playing and mimicking the world and playing Abu Ghraib in the neighborhood. So if we think of the rising action, she's been dealing with these thoughts, she's been dealing with this disconnect between games children play and, of course, the real life horror that they're enacting. The climax of the story is seeing the kids play Abu Ghraib made me feel sick. Didn't they know? Hadn't anyone told them it wasn't right? That's what they saw on television was sickening. The treatment of people as playthings, the value of being seen as humans stripped away. Notice how the language in this quote really shifts. So we can really hear in each descriptor how sickened she is, how she really emphasizes that by repeating sick and sickening, how she really comments on that using the repetition of questions, and of course, ending with the value of being seen as human stripped away. So this is really when she comes to the realization and she is no longer dealing with her experience as a child, but now just dealing with this issue. So she's leaving that internal conflict behind and then progressing to really comment on it. So what's interesting about Liz Huerta's story is the falling action and the denouement are very short. This is because the falling action and the denouement for her, the resolution, is really centered not on Huerta herself, but on society. So this is because of that underlying emphasis in the inciting incident about the political significance. So she is really using the end of the story to comment on the problems within society. If we think about the resolution specifically, when she says it isn't just our kids who are comfortable playing the role of jailer against inmate, cowboy against Indian, immigrant against border patrol agent. We live comfortable in the light and in the roles that society sets out for us, but we too often miss the truth hidden in the shadows our actions leave behind. Our eyes have trouble adjusting to see the wider reality that those people in the shadows are also people, that it isn't just a game. So, thinking of that resolution, she's really just focusing on commenting on this issue for our society. So, it's bringing it in that way to kind of a call to action. She's not being explicit in telling us that we need to change, but she's really inferring, implying that we do need to change because this is a problem we're ignoring because, of course, we're comfortable. We tend to ignore what doesn't really affect us. And she is acknowledging that that is very wrong. So, thinking of the plot arc here in Huerta's story, it is really important to note that the exposition, the falling axe the denouement, they don't necessarily have to be of equal lengths. If we notice with Liz Huerta's story, especially, the exposition is the longest portion of the story. So, really, in terms of which part of the plot arc you're emphasizing, is really going to depend on the specific purpose of your story and the specific events that you're focusing on. So, if you think about the purpose of Liz Huerta's story, it's to really comment on the games kids are playing and how much we need to teach children about what's really going on in the world so they're not reenacting these terrible things. So, if we think of that purpose, really emphasizing the description of what the game was that she played as a child is really playing into making that real so that we can make that connection as well instead of her just telling us what we should be taking away from the story. So moving forward with our first paper, we're going to be focusing on creating a plot arc very similar. It doesn't necessarily have to be really heavy in exposition like Huerta's story. It could be really emphasizing the rising action. It could emphasize the resolution. That's really going to depend on the stories you guys choose to tell in your stories. If you have any questions about this, feel free to let me know. Until next time, have a good one.